me see here. Okay, so this, I want to start by welcoming all of you who are able to join us today through these different channels. We have framed this event of today as with the theme Beyond Sustainability, Ecological Civilization as an Ecological Integrity. And this is our second webinar of a series of webinars, 4 of them, that we have organized to offer a space to talk about ecological civilization and their strata. And with this, we want to explore the meaning of ecological civilization and see how their strata can offer some guidance or foundations to that. This first webinar, the first webinar took place about a month ago on the 10th of September. And the recordings of that are available both in YouTube and Tencent Meeting, and similar to this webinar of today. This event is the result of a collaborative effort between various organizations, the Earth Charter International, the University for Peace, the Institute of Ecological Civilization, the Center for Process Studies, the PACE Center for Green Tech and Development that is based in Beijing, and the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation that is also based in Beijing. I am welcoming you from Costa Rica, where I'm based. I'm Mirian Vilela. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Charter International, which has an education center that is located here in Costa Rica at the University for Peace. We are organizing this event and discussion of today as part of our UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development with the Earth Charter, which has the purpose to generate educational programs, courses, materials, research activities on that intersection of sustainability, values, and education. Now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our 3 guest speakers of today. I want to thank each one of them for joining us today. And let me start by introducing them. So first we have the honor of having Fritjof Capra, who is here today. Fritjof Capra is a very well-known scientist and system theorist who happens also to be a member of the Earth Charter International Council. Capra is the author of several books, including The Tao of Physics, The Turning Point, and The Web of Life. I suppose many have already read them, or some of them. And this is just to name a few of his books. Something very interesting, in March 2015, Capra came to Costa Rica, and I had the pleasure to co-facilitate with him an intensive course on leadership and system thinking, in which he synthesizes the core thinking and ideas from his book, The Systems View of Life. He has been dedicating the past years to his very successful online course called the Capra course. Alice Hughes is also joining us today from China, from Beijing. She is associate professor and leader of a landscape ecology group at Sichuan Bana Tropical Botanical Garden. Alice is the Deputy Secretary General of the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. And she's a member of the Chinese Academy of Science. Thank you, Alice. And Jeremy Lent, who is also here joining us today, now based in California. He's the author of the book, The Pattern Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. Jeremy is the founder of the Biology Institute. And if you visit Jeremy Lent's website, you'll see that he raises a number of very interesting questions. And he's working on a number of interesting themes that are very related to the work we do, and especially to the theme of this webinar. I learned this week that he contributed to a newly published book called The New Possible, with a chapter from him on ecological civilization. So thank you for the 3 of you for accepting to be with us here today. So I would like to start by asking each one of our speakers to share some thoughts on their perspective on what is ecological civilization. And let me ask first Fritjof Capra. Thank you, Fritjof.
Mirian, thank you for having me on this program. I'm very happy to contribute to this webinar. It just occurred to me that Alice, Jeremy, and I, all three have very strong ties to China. So I'm especially happy to speak to many people who are logging in from China. Alice, of course, lives in China, has lived there for a number of years. And Jeremy and I have both been deeply influenced by Chinese philosophy and culture. So it is a great pleasure to engage in conversations with people from China. So what is an ecological civilization? In my view, an ecological civilization would be designed in such a way that its ways of life, its businesses, economy, technologies, and so on, honor, support, and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. And it would be based, first of all, on the knowledge of how nature sustains life. In other words, on the understanding of the principles of organization that nature's ecosystems have evolved over billions of years to sustain the web of life. This understanding has become known as ecological literacy. The second step would be to use this ecological knowledge, ecological understanding, to radically redesign our technologies and social institutions so as to bridge the current gap between human design and the sustainable ecological communities that we see in nature. It would mean designing for life in such a way that our design principles mirror the basic principles of ecology. And this is known as eco-design. And finally, I want to emphasize that an ecological civilization would be inherently regenerative, a word much used nowadays, and justifiably so. It would be inherently regenerative because nature's way of sustaining life is inherently regenerative. So I will leave it at that, and I really look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Fritjof. Let me invite now Alice Hughes to come to the floor and share your thoughts on what is ecological civilization to you.
Thank you, Mirian. So as Fritjof already said, ecological civilization basically means living in harmony with nature. And it's actually a fundamental part of the 2050 vision of the CBD, is to basically fulfill the vision of ecological civilization. Many recent different institutions, different ideologies have also focused on things like nature-based solutions. Now, all of these are meant to take learning points and a basis from nature. However, something China is striving strongly towards is using science as the basis for enabling us to move towards that vision. That means not necessarily using what might be an easy or simple solution, like for climate greening, we might say, okay, let's plant lots of trees. But for that to be part of ecological civilization, it needs to have a fundamental basis in ecology. That means understanding what species should be there, having something that supports life, that supports natural communities, and using that to fulfill that vision so that both biodiversity is maintained and human ecosystem services are also maintained in harmony. And finding that fundamental balance is an essential part of what eco-civilization strives to be. Globally, we are moving towards that vision. We understand that we have an inter-reliance upon nature and many services delivered by it, from clean water to pollination. Maintaining that means maintaining ecology. And as we'll talk more about later in this webinar, there are multiple different ways that we need to move in order to meet that vision. So we aren't just doing it in a relatively shallow and simple way, a way to tick boxes and say we planted trees. It needs a basis of ecology, so it provides the fundamental life support systems that we are all reliant upon.
Okay, thank you so much, Alice. May I invite now Jeremy Lentz to come to the floor?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Well, let me kind of build on the conversation that we've had so far, because I agree that, like, ultimately what I see as an ecological civilization is one that, just as both Fritjof and Alice said, is life affirming. And I think what's crucial is to realize that we're talking about a fundamental shift in the basis of the civilization we live in right now. So when we look at our civilization now, it's wealth affirming. It's based on wealth accumulation. It's based on exploitation of natural resources and exploitation of other human beings. So we're talking about a civilization where the actual foundation is different. And that leads to all kinds of very, very significant impact throughout. So if we kind of look to follow Fritjof's idea of what are some of the sort of organizing principles of natural ecosystems, we see things like symbiosis, where each party gains from a reciprocal relationship. So if we translate that into actual society, human society, it goes directly to things like fairness, justice, individual dignity. And again, an ecosystem, it thrives on diversity. So in an ecological civilization, one of the fundamentals would be recognizing the inherent rights of different peoples to participate in their own way in the overall culture, and not as separate from it, but as an integrated part of it. So there's all kinds of areas like that where we look at how things infiltrate to actually totally change how we're thinking about our civilization. One crucial one is right now, because of this exploitation basis of our civilization, it's growth-based. It actually has to grow in order to maintain some level of stability. And it only grows at the expense of consuming the earth in unsustainable ways and actually consuming human activity, turning human activity into part of the monetized economy. So in a ecological civilization, the basis would be one of balance and circularity, and it would be certainly growth in the quality of our lives, which always, that is something that can grow exponentially, indefinitely, but it would totally shift this growth in the material consumption and production we're looking at right now. So those are just some of the major pointers that get me so excited about it.
Thank you so much. So I heard the words regenerative, balanced, circularity, and completely changing the way we perceive civilization. Thank you.
Miriam,
Why? Yes.
Comment. I want to make a comment on something that Jeremy just said, when he said that symbiosis in nature translates into justice and human dignity in human society. Now, this is a very subtle point, because we must not think that there is justice and dignity in nature. We may project this into nature, but this would be anthropomorphic. However, the principles, if you wish, the principles of organization, of symbiosis, when experienced by human consciousness, translate into justice, dignity, and so on. So this shows us that these human values are anchored in nature, although they cannot be directly translated into nature. I think that's an important and rather subtle point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are going to hold that word also, symbiosis. So why do you think is that important for us to be thinking and talking about ecological civilization? And what do you think are the roadblocks and possibilities to get there? Maybe let's do the same order. Fritjof, Alice, and
Well,
Jeremy.
it is not only important, but it is absolutely critical, because we find ourselves globally in an existential crisis. This crisis has multiple aspects. We have right now the health crisis with the COVID pandemic. We have an economic crisis. We have the crisis of social justice. We have the climate crisis. We have many, many facets of this crisis, which in fact fundamentally is one and the same crisis, deriving from an outdated worldview, and in particular deriving from the irrational obsession of our economists and politicians with the illusion that unlimited growth is possible on a finite planet. It's completely nonsensical, and yet they all subscribe to it and compete with one another to accelerate growth without limits, without a consideration of the damage that is done. So we urgently need to shift from this obsession with GDP growth, which is quantitative and extractive, to a growth that is qualitative and regenerative. To me, that's the critical change we need to make.
Thank you. Alice?
So Fritjof raised a very important point. We are currently facing a global health crisis. We know that one of the major contributors is the fact that we've been unsustainably utilizing ecosystems. We've been mass deforesting. We've been mass mining and displacing animal species. This kind of unsustainable activity basically brings stressed animals in contact with humans and with livestock systems. We are literally undermining our fundamental life support system. If we continue to do this, we will continue to see these kinds of events. If we look on a global basis, this year we have unprecedented levels of Californian, Amazon, and Australian fires. These are a direct consequence of climate change, but they also accelerate it. If we look at the Arctic and Antarctic, we are seeing unprecedented rates of ice break-off and ice melt. We are hurtling towards what we know as these tipping points. And in the global planetary boundary framework, we know that once we pass these tipping points, we go past the point of no return. We fundamentally change the way we all exist on this planet. Now, none of us want to approach these tipping points. The only way that we can actually avoid it is by fundamentally changing the way we live. That means understanding our interrelationships and interdependence by biodiversity and ecosystem services. The fact that even those of you who it's only early morning with today have probably already eaten things that were unsustainably sourced. Unless we are conscious of our own footprints and our footprint on this planet, we are not going to make the cognizant decisions to decrease what that footprint is. This isn't as simple as limiting our carbon output. It's also thinking about the footprint of our food, being more connected with what we are reliant upon, and then making demonstrative efforts to change that. And I'll be talking a little bit about some of what that takes later, but having a global consciousness of how interconnected and interreliant we are is essential if we are going to make the decisions to change that footprint. And of course, an ecological civilization is made up of people and acting members who make active decisions as to what they want to do. It needs to be supported by policies, but unless you have a population that is actually motivated to do it, you are not going to be effective. So it is not something that is just part of society. This is a whole of society and whole of planet issue that requires whole of society action if we are going to be effective in changing it.
Thank you so much. We need to expand and deepen our consciousness with regards to how we ought to live here and the footprints we have. Thank you, Alice. Jeremy?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alice. That was so wonderfully stated. Yeah, I love that. And one thing I would add, because I just completely agree with what both Fritjof and Alice described there, in terms of what's so important about it. But there's one more extra element, is that right now, just as Alice was describing, we're seeing things basically falling apart. People are getting terrified. People are getting freaked out by what's going on. And even people who are really have been generally part of sort of more mainstream thinking are beginning to just see things really not working. But the strange thing is that when that happens, there's this famous quote from Slavoj Žižek, which is, it's easier for people to to sort of visualize the end of capitalism than, well, no, the end of the world than the end of capitalism is the point, is that it's basically people can get a sense of like, we're heading for collapse. This is wrong, that's wrong. We need to do something differently. But it's much harder for people to get a vision of what we can actually move towards. And that's why I get so excited by this notion of an ecological civilization, because one thing it shows is that it is possible to design our civilization in a way that makes sense, in a way that could be a beautiful place to live for humans and all the other non-human living beings on this earth together. And then another thing it shows is that right now there are millions of organizations around the world that in their own ways are fighting for an ecological civilization. They just don't necessarily realize what they have in common with so many other organizations. It can be in indigenous movements, it can be in political movements in the cities, it can be in community transformation, it can be spiritual approaches. Like we see that in Catholicism from the Laudato Si of the Pope. We see it in different kind of awakened Buddhist approaches to getting engaged with things. And I think we can actually begin to recognize that this framework, this vision of an ecological civilization becomes almost like an umbrella for all these groups to join together. And as Fritjof could explain even better about systems and complex systems, it's like when they are interconnected and when they amplify each other through those connections, the system can transform in ways that are powerful and nonlinear and unexpectedly go through a phase transition. And that's what seems to me is the possibility that can arise from this vision of an ecological civilization, really almost like a top-down vision with all the bottom-up pieces becoming part of this system change that we need.
Thank you so much. I like to hear this emphasis on the importance of having a vision. And if we can just have that vision, that we can move towards that direction. Thank you. The next question, I would like to start with Jeremy Lentz, because you have also been thinking and working so much on this. And the question is, what are the values and worldviews needed to help this paradigm shift towards ecological civilization?
Yes, well, I think we have to first look at the implicit values that are the fabric of our current civilization. And if you kind of go really deep, at the bottom of it all is the values based on separation. They're based on a sense of humans as being separate from the rest of the non-human world. They're based on humans as being separate from each other. And they're even based on the sense that there's this kind of belief that has become inculcated throughout so much of global thought that actually, if you look at even biology, we're driven by genes, which we're told are selfish genes, and therefore it's actually natural for all creatures to be selfish. And then we're told, well, capitalism works so well because it's each selfish person rationally pursuing their own ends. Those are all values based on misconceptions. And instead of those values, an ecological civilization would be actually one, to your point, Alice, about science-based, would actually be based on what findings in modern science, in evolutionary biology, in systems science, in anthropology, you name it, is showing us that actually we are deeply interconnected. So rather than these values based on separation, they'd be values based on our deep connection with each other. A recognition that humans are part of the natural earth, And the earth is not a resource for us to exploit, but rather it's something that, to this point of symbiosis, we can find a way to actually thrive symbiotically with a living earth. It's not necessary for there to be the split between humans and life, but it's actually possible for us to develop technologies, develop systems so that we can actually thrive on an earth that thrives with us. So I think that's a fundamental value. Equally is when we look at human interaction with other humans, is the concept of this deep connectedness within community and connectedness with all of humanity. So we need to recognize that when some parts of our species are deeply suffering, whether it's in our own cities, nations, or elsewhere in the world, we as humans, from this place of deep connectedness, are also suffering along with that. And to live a really full life, this concept of what I call fractal flourishing, that we need to be able to flourish at all fractal layers from our self, community, society, and the whole living earth for a true, full, integrated flourishing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Fractal flourishing. Just took a note on that. Thank you so much. Alice, why do you think, what are these kind of values and worldviews that are needed to help us shift towards ecological civilization?
Well, for one thing, I think we need to realize that sustainable doesn't necessarily mean we need to compromise on life quality. Yes, we need to change the way we live, but it doesn't mean that it is lesser than we have now. If we think about the way we live our lives, if we spend more money than we have, we go overdraft and there are consequences. If we utilize resources in an unsustainable way, there are also consequences. So we need to realize that the cost of exploiting ecosystems in an unsustainable way in the short term is going to have long-term costs. At an individual level, we can translate this into things like health. The fact that if we are using lots of chemicals to increase our yields, there are likely to be health consequences. And we know that this is the case. You can actually go across society and apply these same principles. When we do things that are unsustainable, there are often costs on people who may not be aware of them. So communicating that more effectively is part of it. Another thing, as I said earlier, is to realize that we are all interconnected and this world is becoming increasingly interconnected. The fact that we may not see the cost of our actions doesn't mean that they are not happening. So if we actually make people more connected, more cognizant of the impact they are having more widely, be that buying unsustainable palm oil or having something that was drenched in chemicals locally, we can make better decisions. Then there is the other aspect, the fact that people may not be able to afford to make these good decisions. It's all well and good to say, well, you should buy organic, it's better. But what if it's more expensive? And this is where we can have actual mechanisms to enable people to make the decisions that they want to make. For example, putting a added cost on top of something that is unsustainable to subsidize something that is sustainable, giving people these psychological nudges to help them make something that is both economically sensible, but is also better for them. And as I said at the beginning of this short talk, we need to also get away from the perception that sustainable costs more or is worse for us. There are now entire states in India that are going towards what they call natural farming or zero input budget farming, which means not adding chemical fertilizers. They get a bigger yield at the end, it is better for the environment, and it is better for people. So we've radically gone in one direction thinking it's going to help us. What we've ended up with is food that is less nutritious because it's full of water. We need to take a step back, go towards a better life, which is better for us, and realize that quantity and quality are not the same. When people are told these things, they are often surprised. But this is the reality, and it is because of a capitalist system. We need to go back towards quality and remind people of those values as well as their own impacts.
Thank you so much, Alice. Fritjof, for you, what are the values and worldviews needed for this shift?
I think, Miriam, you selected your speakers very well because we sort of can almost finish each other's sentences, which is wonderful. And I want to just enlarge at what Alice just said, that we need to take into account capitalism. And when you said, Alice, that organic is more expensive, there's a reason for that. It shouldn't be more expensive. You know, organically grown food or agroecologically grown food has fewer energy inputs, you know, fewer transportation, you know, is grown locally, fewer chemicals. Everything should make it cheaper, but it's more expensive. Why? Because governments massively support the industrialized chemical agriculture. And why do they do this? Because agribusiness has a lot of money and politicians are corrupt. And they are being paid to pass laws that favor the large agribusiness corporations. So this is not a coincidence. So in addition to changing our habits and, you know, fighting for healthier food and living accordingly, we also need to be politically active and just expose the scandal of these huge subsidies of food that is killing us. So that is very important. And finally, just switching to Jeremy again, I want to just add a footnote that what you said about, you know, our being connected with nature is, of course, embodied in the concept of biophilia by E.O. Wilson, which means literally love of nature, and which says that we evolved together with nature and we are healthy and happy and balanced if we stay in harmony with nature, and we feel better.
Good. Fritjof, let me continue with you. What do you think? Can the Earth Charter principles provide a framework for building that vision of ecological civilization?
Yes, absolutely, because we are talking about values. We have talked a lot about values in this conversation. We have talked about worldviews, but also about values. And it's absolutely essential to talk not only about a shift of perception, but also a change of values. And this is where the Earth Charter comes in, because the Earth Charter is a magnificent declaration of ethical principles and ethical values. It was composed in a unique global process in around 2000. And when you read it today, it's still fully valuable. As it says in the preamble, it gives the values to create a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. It exhorts us to behave in a way that is behavior for the common good, which is ethical behavior. And what I love especially in the Earth Charter is this phrase of the community of life, which unifies those two concepts: community, that is very important in ecology. Ecological communities are the units of sustainability, and life, so the community of life to which we all belong.
Wonderful. So I would like to shift now to our last question before we take the questions from our audience. May I ask Alice to come first? Alice, what are the driving forces of the current civilization, and what could be the drivers of ecological civilization?
Well, it's a complex question, unsurprisingly. First, we need to think about what is driving demand and what is driving us to live the way we live. The other is thinking about the mechanisms to actually move towards a more ecological civilization. So many of us are conditioned that more is better, that more expensive is better, but actually we often don't have the information we need to make those decisions. Better communication to enable people to make those decisions in an informed way is part of that. Then there are the actual mechanisms to actually allow that. For one thing, if we look at our food systems, we often have a lot of processed food. Not only is it unhealthy for us as individuals, but it's often very unsustainable in terms of the ingredients required. If we are thinking about making it affordable for people to make sustainable choices, then we can actually use things like both subsidies as well as tariffs that incentivize healthy eating. For example, less unsustainable palm oil, for example. This is becoming easier and easier because we live in a world that we are developing the tools to enable us to source where ingredients are from. For example, there are now tracking methods to look at supply chains to see how sustainable they are, to make deforestation-free supply chains, even on the very micro level. So there are things like Starling verification, which will enable you to see if the food you are eating is having a negative footprint. So you need to work to create a market, to enable people to make informed choices, but also to make it financially viable so that people are not saying, well, I need to eat and this is cheap and it's not having a cost, except it's having a huge environmental cost. Part of that involves taking a fundamental U-turn on the way we've been living, in a way that big companies make a huge amount of money and the rest of us pay for those choices. So it requires education, and it also requires the mechanisms to enable people to make those choices. In addition, we need to think more widely. We still have huge infrastructural development. We still have huge levels of deforestation in many parts of the world. Many of this is part of a footprint which is not actually being properly measured in global targets. Globally, countries have their nationally determined contributions. They have their national biodiversity conservation plans. Many of these do not take account for the fact that they have offset their footprint by unsustainably utilizing resources from elsewhere. We now have the tools to do that better. We know that when certain countries have decided they are going to be more sustainable nationally, it has actually just offset that impact elsewhere. And we are becoming more cognizant about that, but it's time to start actioning it, making people being able to make sustainable choices, but also on a national level. If we are looking at a country's footprint, it needs to include the embodied footprint in terms of deforestation and other costs elsewhere. Because until we do that, then the developed countries are always going to be putting pressure on developing countries, and we are going to be losing our natural resources and our biodiversity elsewhere, because those countries cannot economically afford to turn down investment. If we are going to enable that, it means making Western buyers care about sustainability and giving them the ability to act on that footprint and make sustainable choices.
Thank you, Alice. I'm gonna turn now to Jeremy on the same question, and then to Fritjof. The question is, what are the driving forces of the current civilization, and what could be the drivers for ecological civilization?
Sure. Yeah, well, to me, what seems clear is the driving force of our current civilization is one of exploitation of resources. And that's kind of manifested in this global capitalism that's become just the sort of de rigueur, sort of the water we all swim in, that we just take that as granted. But capitalism basically is, if you will, it's the ideology of exploitation, of saying like other things that you're not owned are there resources to turn into wealth for yourself. And, you know, there's this concept of human supremacy, which I think underlies so much of our way of thinking that we take for granted so much we don't even think about. You know, people are familiar, I think, probably with this concept of white supremacy, where which we recognize as one of the fundamentals that we try to overcome in racist ideologies, where there's this notion for white people that somehow they are above people who are not white, and it's okay for them to exploit those people because they see themselves as higher. But what we are less aware of is that we have that same notion with the rest of the earth that we live on. There's this sense that as humans, and this came from the Western way of thinking, which then became globalized, that we somehow are in this position where it's okay for us to just exploit everything to the maximum that we can. So that even now, when we talk about conservation, a lot of the time it's phrased in ways like ecosystem services, or ways that try to persuade us that it's actually better for us as humans if we do this or that, rather than, no, we live on an earth and our identity is part of that earth. And I feel thrilled to have so many people from China and East Asia being present in this talk, because as Fritjof was saying, he and I both have drawn so much inspiration from these deep traditional Chinese ways of looking at the human relationship with nature as being more in a sort of harmonic web of life, or in the Tao Te Ching's beautiful line where it says for humans to be reverent as guests in the Tao on earth. And that's the kind of driving force that we need to shift, to recognize that right now, what we take for granted is this global corporate sucking life out of the living earth, sucking life out of us as human beings just for profit making. We've got to recognize that. And as really around the world, as a grassroots movement, we have to start to, people to look at each other and say, no, I actually care about life. And we're going to join together to change this system to one that actually makes us as human beings happiest on this earth with the rest of life.
Fritjof?
Well, I want to continue both observations of Alice and Jeremy and point out a very interesting pattern here. When we look at the values that are driving what you call current civilization, as opposed to the values that could drive an ecological civilization, then we see that current civilization is driven by a desire of expansion rather than conservation, by competition rather than cooperation, by quantity rather than quality, by domination rather than partnership. And if you look at these values, you realize that the expansion, competition, quantity, domination can be seen as values of self-assertion. And the others, conservation, cooperation, quality, partnership, can be seen as values of integration. And we all know that the Chinese sages thousands of years ago have associated these values with the two dynamic principles of Yang and Yin. So the values of self-assertion would be the Yang values, and the values of integration, the Yin values. And what we need, according to Chinese wisdom, is a harmony between these two value systems, the Yin and the Yang.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to hear all of you. And I wanted to acknowledge that we have started to receive many questions that are now being written in the chat box. We have people that are following us from Zimbabwe, Osman. So I think it's wonderful to have this technology that is bringing us together. So Osman from Zimbabwe, we have people from Japan who are here with us, in addition to China, of course. And I'm very happy to see people from India who are joining us, and some interesting questions coming from through YouTube and I think Facebook. And before looking at these questions, I would like to invite Andrew Schwartz, who is here with us. Andrew is the Executive Director of the Center for Process Studies and Assistant Professor at Claremont School of Theology. So Andrew, would you like to give us a response or your thoughts on what you have heard from our three guest speakers?
Sure. So this has been phenomenal, by the way. And I agree with what Fritjof said. It's amazing how there's so much synergy between what each of the panelists are saying, that they can almost just finish each other's sentences. And I'm over in the corner being like, yeah, say it again. Like, so it's this positive reinforcement of the need for this deep transformation, which I appreciate. As I listen to all that you're saying, I'm met with the realization of just how complex what we're talking about, really is, and that complexity can be overwhelming for people. So, in a sense, I think recognizing that we aren't faced with separate crises, right? Some social, some environmental, but just one complex civilizational crisis actually does kind of simplify things, right? Because we don't have this long list of global challenges, right? Saving the whales and saving the rainforest and dealing with poverty. Like, we don't have to check each one of those off separately, right? We now just have one big problem, right? A civilizational challenge. But at the same time, expanding the scope that way, right, of talking about civilizational level change seems so comprehensive and so complex that I think it can be even just exhausting to consider what that means. So as our panelists have said, right, we need a change of consciousness, values, and of worldviews. We need a change in systems, our economic systems, political, educational, systems of production and consumption, and so on. We also need top-down changes, policy changes, as well as bottom-up changes of our individual habits. We need changes in local communities. We need changes on a global scale. It's exhausting to even try to frame all that we actually need. How do we accomplish this, and where do we begin? That's my question to you as panelists.
Who would like to pick that question?
Sure. I'd be happy to. Or, yeah.
Jeremy, then we'll
Sure.
turn to the other questions.
Well, let me just answer it kind of quickly on two fronts. One is just personally, where can each of us begin? And I think that we have to begin from really our hearts, from just this sense of what actually feels right to us, and to recognize that what we're being told by our mainstream culture is just wrong. And to actually be starting to connect at the different layers, to connect with those around us from a place of actually this kind of sense of shared identity, to recognize that we're part of community and actually get engaged in helping to transform our local community to one that's more life-affirming. And just as importantly, to recognize that we can't switch off those big global systemic political issues, but we have to engage at that level too. So but in all the places, it's coming from our heart, coming from this recognition that we care about life. And then just to touch on a different way of answering that question, and maybe we can explore this a little bit more further in this conversation. But then the question becomes, what are the sort of policies that can move us from this incredibly capitalistic oriented thing here to this other set of policies? And I think what's very valuable is to consider this notion of trim tabs. It's this concept of like when an ocean liner is moving direction, the trim tab is this little sort of rudder at the front that just begins to help to shift the currents so that the whole thing can move without kind of toppling over. So then we ask, what are the short-term things we can get behind now that move us to that fundamentally different kind of civilization? So to me, one exciting trim tab, for example, is the idea of a universal basic income, which basically of true universal income, unconditional, enough for everybody to live on, and one that is actually goes beyond just one particular area for everyone. The reason that would be so exciting, for example, is that it would subvert the relationship between capital and labor that has dominated people's lives for centuries now, where people have to sell their life basically in order to earn a livelihood, essentially give their life to be part of this system. But if there was a universal basic income, which is something that in many countries of the world right now, there's a lot of excitement behind, it would lead towards people beginning to start to put their attention and their focus on what is actually most important to them. And you would begin to see much more life-affirming activities happening all around. So that's just one example of a trim tab that I think is exciting.
May I continue with this, Mirian?
Yes, and then I'll give you another question to address to you.
I just want to continue on this. From a systemic perspective, it is clear that the major problems of our time are all systemic problems, all interconnected and interdependent, and they require corresponding systemic solutions. What many people don't realize is that these solutions exist today. In our book, The Systems View of Life, which I wrote with Pierluigi Luisi, we spent 60 pages reviewing the most important systemic solutions that have been developed around the world. And we conclude that we have the knowledge, the technologies, and the financial means to solve all the problems. We don't need to start from scratch. We have the solutions, but we need to be able to implement them. And just to put it in another way, I recently participated in another webinar like this, where I was asked, what would you do if you were the president of the United States? And I told them, I would know exactly what to do. And the same is true for Alice, and the same is true for Jeremy. We would know exactly what to do if we were a world leader, because we are part of a global network of civil society that has developed all these solutions.
Thank you. So let's start taking some questions from our audience. So one of them comes from India, Anupan Sarap. And the question is, can you comment on designs of our civilization that transform it from being symbiotic to exploitative, or vice versa? Fritjof, do you want to take that one?
No, it has to go to Jeremy. He's an expert on that.
Okay.
He wrote a 500-page book about this topic.
Jeremy.
Well, I mean, thank you. I mean, there are so many, but I think one simple one to look at is one design of our current civilization that it really drives so much of what happens is the stock market. This whole concept of needing to earn more and more money in order to meet your stock price. So if any new technologies develop or people get these great ideas, they can start off with the best intentions, and which we see in the experience of the internet. Like, here's this great technology, we can all connect together, we can build this sense of shared human connectivity. But as soon as those great ideas get taken up by the capitalist system with this kind of stock market valuation thing, with these for-profit companies, then what we lose all of these positive life-affirming elements to it, and then everything becomes, how can we manipulate, how can we use the data to manipulate people so we can make more money from them, so we can meet our shareholder returns. And what's key to realize, most of the people doing these designs are good people who actually have good intentions, who actually care about what they're doing. And then they have so little power compared to the system that they're part of. So the best design that we can come up with is a design that takes away the powers of this for-profit, stock market-based, wealth and growth-based approach, such as one simple example. If you look right now, transnational corporations, like, they dominate our world. If you look at the 100 largest economies in the world right now, 69 of them are transnational corporations. And they are really pathological in the sense that if they were persons, they would be defined as insane, because they just have this one driver to maximize shareholder value at the expense of everything else. But that's who actually controls our world right now. So one simple design that would be powerful, but actually quite simple, would be to make a rule around the world that large corporations are only allowed to have a charter if they re-charter their business to have a triple bottom line, so that they're not just focused on profits, but also people and the planet. So caring about their community and the planet. And they could lose their charter if a panel of people chosen by sortition from around the world determined that they're not meeting that triple bottom line. And that one change alone would change the design of this system in a way. I'm not saying that in itself would lead to an ecological civilization, but it would lead to fundamental shifts. And that's the kind of ways in which we need to think about it. We need to imagine beyond what our current discourse talks about and look at what can we change to transform things.
Jeremy, there are corporations like this, aren't there? The so-called B corporations.
Absolutely, but they are voluntary. So you have a couple of thousand of them around the world, one or two well-known corporations, but that has virtually zero impact on what goes on, because in fact, if you do recharge it to be a benefit corporation, you are at a disadvantage compared to your competitor, who can just go ahead and mine that copper and all the pollution they want, because you're actually trying to care about it more. So what I'm talking about is taking these ideas and actually making them that they are a requirement for every corporation around the world to fundamentally change the playing field.
And what's very interesting is if we think about all of the multilateral agreements and things, these aren't in the global biodiversity frameworks. These mechanisms that are essential to actually being effective are not there. And some of you will have, that after a decade of biodiversity, we achieved none of the IHU targets. We are not going to do better in the global biodiversity framework unless we actually look at these mechanisms, look at where these profits are coming from, make people accountable and liable for the impacts they're having. And if we look at the areas of the world that have the greatest biodiversity, they are losing their biodiversity because of these big multilateral corporations that are not accountable for their impact. We need to think about how to make them accountable, make sure there are the financial mechanisms in place to ensure that, or we are going to fail the 2050 and 2030 visions.
Thanks, Alice. This actually has to do with a question that we received from the audience, from a YouTube viewer, Peter Sang from Michigan. Is what about accountability? What would accountability look like? He says, what roles does accountability play in all of this? We know from game theory and Ostrom's work that accountability is a significant factor in these kinds of change. But how it would look like, I guess that's his question.
Well, I think accountability would mean, among other things, that our politicians be accountable to the people who have voted for them rather than to the corporations and wealthy individuals who support them. We, in the United States, but also in other countries, we have the grotesque situation where certain legislation is supported by 70% of the population or 80% of the population, and yet it doesn't even come up in Congress because the wealthy 1% are against it because it doesn't further their business. And so because they pay politicians to do what they tell them to do, the legislation never makes it even to discussion. So there's widespread corruption which prevents true accountability.
Let me add one more on that, which is so incredibly important, Fritjof. And then there's one idea that I get so excited by, which is to make ecocide a crime at the International Criminal Court. There's an organization called, I think they're called Abolish Ecocide or Stop Ecocide, to really having significant impact on getting people to wake up to this possibility. And again, this would lead to tremendous accountability. So those transnational corporations that Alice, you were just describing that right now don't have accountability would actually have to start to say, oh, wait a minute. I don't want to, if the CEO would be starting to think, I don't want to get pulled up to the Hague and have to sit there as if I'm some criminal and face maybe even prison time. I will need to start looking at things in a different way. So it really is a way of, again, shifting mechanisms at a different level in the system that could actually change things even while the system itself feels like it hasn't been changed so much.
Well, I think we should acknowledge here the British lawyer, is it Polly Higgins?
Polly Higgins, yes.
Who championed this cause of ecocide.
Exactly.
Crime.
So there's a couple of important points to mention there. One is that politicians like being re-elected in most countries, so many of them are basically aiming to please the short-term aims of voters. And this is a big problem in much of the world because it means that they do not need to be held accountable for many of their legislations because the outcomes are going to play out many years later. Now, China actually has an advantage here because we don't have the same kinds of political terms, which means that there does need to be a long-term thought about what are the impacts of these new regulations going to be. One good example in terms of instituting ecological civilization is ecological red lines. So China has an ecological red line system rolled out across the country, which is basically aiming to maintain ecosystem service provision and biodiversity countrywide. If we want to roll that out more widely, then we can say, okay, well, the ecological red line principle should not just apply to within the country. It should be applied to all firms that are actually registered to the country, even if they are acting outside. And many of the big firms globally are still registered to one country, even if they're developing elsewhere. So if we say that they are accountable and they are only going to have their registration renewed if they fulfill certain criteria, you have a mechanism to hold them accountable. Because if they don't have registration anymore, it's very difficult for them to continue to act.
There is a comment question here from Japan, Joan Anderson, and she expresses, thank you so much for your inspiring words. I feel that one key phrase is when basic needs have been met, human development is primarily about being more, not having more. Would you, it would be nice if you could explore more this idea, if you'd like to comment. Let's see who wants to join.
Well, I think we can say that this phrase, this very important and well-known phrase about being more rather than having more, is reflects the difference between quality and quantity, because being is a quality and having more is a quantity. And we referred to this before, that living sustainably does not mean lowering our living standards. On the contrary, it means raising our living standards, having clean air, enjoying healthy, uncontaminated food, enjoying local communities, all the advantages of being an active and vibrant part of the community of life are qualities of being rather than qualities of having. And in my view, this is one of the reasons why community is so important, because in our daily lives today, we are bombarded by advertising day in, day out, which tells us the only way for you to be happy is to buy that and that product. And if we can show that happiness lies in human relationships more than in acquisition of goods, then this is a very powerful antidote. And that, of course, translates into community. So I often tell people when they ask me what's the first step I can do, I say join communities, create communities, revitalize communities, and so on.
Thank you. I would like to bring here a comment we received from Facebook. We have a Facebook broadcast also, and there's a viewer called Kaylee Moira. And she says, I really value and appreciate what Jeremy Lent is saying about connection, collaboration, and developing systems for thriving. I would like to build on that, Jeremy.
Sure, thank you. Well, really just kind of building off what Fritjof was just saying, I think that it has a lot to do with this concept of identity, that from the Western worldview, which has really now become the sort of globalized worldview, we're told that basically our identity is our individuality, and that we have this kind of fixed self, and that from that, we have to then sort of optimize for ourselves. But once we begin to actually, and we can do this through spiritual practice, we can do it just through actually just feeling into ourselves and being in nature with community. There's many paths, but once we begin to soften that sort of boundary of that self, that fixed boundary, and start to open our identity to actually feel that we are part of community, feel that we are part of Earth, then what's powerful is that we are no longer feeling like we should stop buying more stuff, or we should spend more time with other people, or we should go out in nature. We actually want to do that. That becomes part of who we actually are. And that begins to kind of shift, essentially get us off what's called the hedonic treadmill. It's like, this consumerism that Fritjof was just describing, it didn't just sort of happen by accident. There were cynical people who explicitly developed ways, starting in the early 20th century, to actually get people on this hedonic treadmill, so that they actually explicitly said, we need to train the population to always want more, not to be satisfied with what they have, but to want more and more and more. That way we get to grow more profits. So people get sort of sucked into that. And once you get off that a little bit, you get to sort of relax and get to find that actually there is so much more to life than that hedonic treadmill that you are basically, all of us are basically being programmed by our television and the internet and all other media to be part of.
Thank you, Jeremy. There's a question from a YouTube viewer, Atosa Soltani. So thank you. The question is, how would the money system be redesigned in the transition to an ecological civilization? It seems that ecological destruction and money system growth are related. Anyone of you would like to comment on this?
Yes, I'm on. An important and difficult question. I've been very inspired by the work of Bernard Lietaer, a Belgian economist, who makes a comparison between the circulation of money in human society and the circulation of energy and matter in ecosystems. And he says that whereas we see great diversity in ecosystems, many pathways, many alternative ways of doing things, great resilience, our economic system has only one kind of money and one kind of banking system. And he advocates what is already being developed in many places, alternative sources of money, local currencies, different ways of cooperating, of bartering, of exchanging goods. And this would make the economy much more resilient, stronger and much more resilient.
Okay, thank you so much. There is a question here. Human civilization is based on building blocks of economics, politics, and technology. Are these inherently exploitative?
Yeah, unless Alice, do you want to go?
You can make a start and I'll add to it if there's anything further to add, Jeremy.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I think this is just such an interesting question, because sometimes when we talk about ecological civilization, people will raise this issue like, isn't that like an oxymoron? Isn't civilization itself, and if you look at the root of that word, it comes from cities, and like the concept of cities separate from the natural world. Isn't civilization itself really based on exploiting the natural world? And so is it even possible to have an advanced civilization, at least, which is not, which is actually in harmony with nature? And I do think that it's important to look at this, but I think that this is actually one of the huge challenges we have, to recognize that at this point in human development, we do have incredible technologies, which, if they are developed in the right kind of ways, from the right kind of framework, do not have to mean that we are exploiting the earth on which we evolved. And I do think that this is where symbiosis is such a key point here. Because imagine a politics, imagine economics, imagine a technology based on this notion of symbiosis, which is what really caused all of the richness and abundance of nature to evolve over billions of years. And symbiosis is very simply this thing of a non-zero sum relationship between two different entities, where one entity says to the other, of course, they don't say it in actual language, but they evolve in that way to say, I've got this particular skill that I can give to you. And if you can give a particular skill back to me, then we're both better off. And of course, those are the relationships that evolved to become like life-affirming and actually stayed around. Because if there was a relationship where one entity got to do well from the other, And that was the only way which when the other entity would die off, and that would be like a dead end path in evolution. So I think these are the great challenges of our time, is to say, how can we develop technologies that actually are symbiosis? How can we develop a technology and say, not just how can it be less, this is a question that the ecological philosopher Freya Matthews asked, which I think is fantastic. Not how can we develop a technology to say, how is it sort of sustainable, less polluting, but how can I develop that technology so that the earth benefits from it? That's a true sense of regenerative. And again, I think we can apply that same approach to economics and politics.
Alice?
So just building on that, and I completely agree with what Jeremy said, no, it isn't an oxymoron, because being unsustainable has massive costs. Let's think for a moment about, say, green power. So people would say, well, hydropower is green. Yes, we build dams, it's green energy. But if we think about it in a holistic way, we realize actually, like everything else, that's often not the case. And we need to think holistically about the impacts. For example, if we think about the Mekong region, a planned 25 dams in that region were estimated to cause a drop on migratory fish biomass by up to 80%. That equates to incomes, because there are more than 52 million people that get 80% of their dietary protein from fish. Suddenly, those people are going to lose their income, they're going to lose their diet. They are then going to deforest other areas to raise cattle, so their diet becomes less healthy. If we think about this holistically, we realize that that's not a sustainable form in terms of livelihood, in terms of the people displaced and the social costs, and in terms of the 1,200 or so fish species that live in that region. These are not small things. So we need to think about the long-term costs. In the case of green power like dams, the fact that they are normally over budget and over time. When we think about these in concert and we think beyond the short term, we realize these have major costs, and therefore we need to act sustainably if we are going to actually have a society that doesn't have major downstream costs.
I want to thank again our YouTube viewers and audience. There's a question from Chile, Manuel Valdez, from an NGO called Docel. How to seduce, his question is, how to seduce city people to slow down, move back to the rural world, and work half of the time to have half of the time for house labors, and learning from nature, cultivating food, and having better educating themselves. It's about changing the city people.
I think we have a great chance now, because we live, since the last 6 months, we live very different lives from before. And we have slowed down. You know, all of us have slowed down massively, and we don't travel, or we don't travel so much. We don't commute to work, or we commute much, much less. And a lot of us are liking that. And I think in the post-COVID world, many people will decide to go on like this to a large extent. So we have a unique opportunity to persuade people to shift from quantity to quality.
Good. A question from Mario Set Morales. How do we help the masses of people find the value of happiness they are already having in their villages, so that they do not abandon their life from a capitalist false dream?
Well, I would say, again, what I said before, to live in community, to experience community. You experience happiness in a very real way when you experience community. And this is the other side of the COVID pandemic. This is what we're lacking now. We have virtual communities, but we can't hug each other. We can't have meals together. And the things, they're very sensuous and physical. But that's, I think, where true happiness lies.
And I think Fritjof is right. COVID has served as a wake-up call for all of us to evaluate what makes us happy, what makes life worth living. And I mean, I've lived overseas for about 14 years, and I know of a lot of people who have decided it's time to go back to their home country. It's time to spend more time with family. This is a wake-up call that we can't continue to live this way, but also to evaluate what's most important in our lives. And I think it's a really important time to really evaluate what that means and to think of ways of doing things that are better, more sustainable, and actually make us happier.
Thank you, Alice. There is a comment question here from Andrew Schwartz that I think you should take, Alice. And it says, many of you have criticized capitalism and GDP growth as a measure of success. How does President Xi's two mountains theory fit here? So maybe someone has to say what is the theory? Two mountain theory fits here. Does green is gold ultimately mean growing GPD through green industry? Similarly, I wonder, what would you say about sustainable development, especially SDG 4? This comes from Andrew. Alice, would you like to take this one?
So it's a very interesting question. In terms of the SDGs, they have inherent benefits and issues. Many of them contradict each other. And thinking about the real impacts of them is also very important. Sustainable development, green industry are often loosely defined. For example, many forms of green power are not actually green when we think about their impacts. I think the green is gold philosophy in terms of thinking about sustainability, thinking about biodiversity is of course very important, as well as the long-term costs. But we do need to make sure that it has a sensible basis from science, from empirical fact and analysis to make sure that it is truly green rather than a greenwash. And the same is true for the SDGs. If we are to realize them, and I was on another call this morning where we were talking a lot about net loss and net gain, and the fact that using oversimplified terms like net without equating it to an ecological value can actually provide loopholes which enable less sustainable development. So we need to be very cognizant, very focused, and really understand what those impacts are. And then yes, green is gold. If we really make sure we value our watersheds, if we value ecosystem services like pollination, but we do need to make sure that it's not being used as a greenwash, so we're not using it to offset and justify yet more unsustainable behaviors.
Alice, can you share what is this two mountains theory and how does it fit here?
One of the other speakers may be able to sum that up better than me, though I've read about it. There are a lot of different ways it can be interpreted.
Oh, nobody wants to jump in. That's a tough one. Andrew, maybe you want to comment on that.
I completely agree with Alice. It's confusing sometimes to try to make sense of a single interpretation of this two mountain theory. But the general idea is that you've got a green mountain and you've got a gold mountain. And rather than pursuing the gold mountain, right, pursuing wealth at the expense of the green mountain, the health of the environment, that we actually are, President Xi is proposing a reconceiving of these two mountains together, where green is gold, and that I'm just a little unclear on exactly what economic development looks like in terms of the health of the environment. And yeah, we'll see.
Thank you. A comment and a question from Manuel Manga from YouTube, through YouTube. And it's basically a request for Fritjof, if you can put those 60 pages of solutions in a document, and if you can share freely with others, and if it's available in your website. That's a question from Manuel Manga.
Well, no, it's not available on the website. It's available in the book, and it's available in my online course, where I have the last lecture of the course is about systemic solutions, and it's 40 minutes long. So it's a compact version. But making it freely available is a great idea. Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you. So the last question comes from China through the Tencent meeting platform that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're thanks to technology and the help of many people who are working with us to make this happen. This event is being live streamed to China through Tencent meeting. And the question is, when we talk about sustainability and ecological civilization, how could we distinguish the poverty and inequality from the advocacy and politics? like the sustainable living and less meat consumption, the total amount of developed countries' consumption are much more than developing countries. But we blame those people from the developing countries because they're increasing demand on meat. It's a long question.
So yeah, let me just kind of make a stab at what I see as the issues coming out of that. And it sort of raises some of these bigger questions that you hear about a lot. So oftentimes when you talk about this unsustainable pace we're on, people will say, yes, it's overpopulation. We're just growing way too much. That's the biggest issue. Or this other, or sometimes if you critique the sort of growth rates of the world, people say, yes, but we need to grow at this rate. What about all those people who need to be brought, developed and brought up to? So oftentimes these issues get misframed. The reality is that right now, roughly 20% of the people in the world who are part of the OECD, or essentially like the global north, are responsible for close to 80% of the carbon emissions, and are responsible for that much of the actual consumption of the earth. And the numbers get even more extreme when you look at like something like, I think the top 10% wealthiest people are responsible for roughly half of all emissions. And so what we need to look at is recognizing that the global north has to transform what it's doing. That is the fundamental number one. And if the global north transforms what it's doing, then it becomes more reasonable for people in the global south to actually start to explore different paths of development, which are more sustainable, basically, which don't involve eating more meat, which we know is destroying our living earth right now, which don't involve consuming more. But as long as everyone in the world turns on their TV or turns on their internet and they see these shows coming out of Hollywood showing that what everyone's meant to aspire to, which is part of this hedonic treadmill that's been created, that can't happen. I think the global north has to recognize it's been responsible for the vast bulk of the global crises we're facing right now. It's gotten almost all the benefits from it. And the people in the global south are getting almost all of the costs and facing almost all of the crises. And we have to look at the change in consciousness at this place and not point to those elsewhere in the global south, but begin where we are right now with changes in our behavior. And that's what I feel strongly.
Thank you.
So
Alice, I'm going to ask you also to offer your last points to Alice and Fritjof. Thank you.
To.
And add to this comment.
Jeremy made some very good points. The human population has been growing at a smaller pace than our global footprint is going. And if we look at global projections going into the future, we see that in everywhere except the African continent, human populations are leveling or dropping, and we're having increasingly elderly populations. However, what we have seen globally is not only an increase in the calorific intake we have, but we've had an increasing reliance on meat, and we've had a global homogenization of diets. This has many consequences. If we move from the once-a-year wet paddy system of rice that we used to see in Asia to the now twice-a-year system, we lose all the species that co-evolve with those systems. But we have an opportunity here to go back to those basics, to go back to our traditions and have more traditional, more nutritious forms of food. And there are ways to incentivize that. A good example would be Ethiopia, where because they only export teff, which is their native grain, once it's been processed, they maintain the profits within the country. So they have a mechanism to maintain native varieties. Native varieties of crop are better for native species. When we go to the meat dimensions, yes, we do need to move away from the fact that more meat is better. We know it's less healthy for us. We know the antibiotics and things within it also have negative consequences for our health. So moving back to a health focus, as well as thinking about the impacts and the footprint associated with our diet, has multifaceted benefits. And countries would actually do very well to incentivize more healthy diets. More grains, more vegetables, better for the environment, better for our health, and therefore lesser economic costs in terms of days off work and other health costs. So there are huge numbers of different benefits that are associated with a diet that actually supports more diversity there. Now, because I'm meant to wind up, I think it's actually a really nice way to show that, yeah, our health is integrated with the environment. The benefits of having a more diverse diet impact on us, but they also sustain more species. And so this has benefits for all. And I think moving towards that, moving towards things like this One Health approach of maintaining biodiversity, maintaining the planet, maintaining our own lives is something that we need to do, not just because being sustainable is better for preserving other species, but because it's an insurance policy for our own health and our own livelihoods into the future.
Thank you. Just before I give the floor to Fritjof, there was a comment from Tencent meeting from Liu that we want to thank, that she says, two mountain theory means lucid waters and lush mountains are invaluable assets. So thank you for that comment. Fritjof, your last comments before we close.
I was going to say almost what Alice just said, so I will expand on that. I talked about systemic problems and systemic solutions, and I often present the example of agriculture as a systemic solution par excellence. A systemic solution does not address any problem in isolation, but always in conjunction, in connection with other problems. And therefore, a systemic solution typically solves many problems at the same time, several problems at the same time. And I very often give this example from agriculture. If we moved massively from the current system of centralized, energy-intensive, chemical, industrial agriculture to organic, community-oriented, regenerative farming, also known as agroecology, this would solve several problems. It would help us alleviate our energy crisis, because at least in the United States, we spend 20% of fossil fuel energy on growing food, growing, processing, and transporting food. The organically grown food would have a huge impact on public health, as Alice just mentioned, because we know that many of our major diseases are directly related to our diet. And finally, agroecologically grown food would have a huge impact on alleviating the climate crisis, because an organic soil is a living soil which is full of carbon, carbon being the backbone, the chemical backbone of life. So an organic soil draws down carbon from the atmosphere and locks it up in biological substances. So three solutions to three problems with one shift from industrial to sustainable regenerative agriculture.
Thank you, Fritjof. Jeremy, your last comment, words, reflection.
Well, I think the one thing I would like to just kind of leave this conversation with is this recognition that when we look at these changes from the point of view of a complex system, as Fritjof was just helping us to look at, we also need to recognize that each of us are part of that complex system, that this shift towards an ecological civilization or all the problems going on, that we're not separate from those, in just the same way that we're not separate from each other that we've been describing, which means that I would just ask each of us in this conversation to look at these questions that have been raised and to look at the ways in which we can engage and actually work together to co-create this future that's possible. I believe that it's very easy to look right now at how terrible things are looking in so many different directions and just get turned off and just totally lose faith in this potential for this kind of vision that I'm sure we're all so excited by. But one thing to remember is this non-linearity of change in human society. And again, complex systems go through phase transitions. And it's only by us, and getting those messages out there, working with each other around the world to create this sense of something shifting that actually leads to this possibility of a change that might take a lot of people by surprise when they just use a straight line to assume where things may be headed right now.
My gratitude to our guest speakers, Alice, Fritjof, and Jeremy Lent. Thank you so much for joining us today. And also I would like to close by thanking all the audience that joined us today through these different channels. And thank technology that it worked today. Had mercy on us. And I thought it was amazing that we have had people from Latin America, Africa, Asia, different countries. Thank you so much. And let me invite you for our next webinar, also on ecological civilization and the Earth Charter, on the 12th of November. That will be our third webinar on the same topic. Thank you so much, everybody.